Thank you. And I must thank the WMG Group, Rajesh and his team for inviting me to speak to such an august audience. I'll start off with the challenge in front of us, because there is so much talk about, Vikisit Bharat 2047. There are economists giving out projections till 2072. I think it's very important to first understand the scale of the challenge that we are facing. The developed world today, or the countries that have a very high per capita income, achieved that over reasonably steady growth over 150 to 200 years. What we are trying to do, and China is also trying to do, is achieve this in 50 years. And there is a reason why I think there needs to be a sense of urgency as well. So it's not that, aaj nahi to kal, so if we don't do it in 50 years, we'll do it in 80 years. Because several things have changed. The pace of demographic transition is much faster today than it has ever been in history. And what I mean by that is the pace at which birth rates are falling, the pace at which death rates are falling. So the pace of demographic transition, till about 100 years back was almost nothing, right? Because birth rates and death rates hadn't changed for centuries, for millennia. But as medicine has improved, as science has improved, and with prosperity coming in, so much of technology, people looking at each other, in most economies, the pace of demographic transition is much faster than the pace of economic transition. And that means that we have already, at a very early stage in our development cycle, slipped below what is called a sustainable rate for the population. The TFR, the total fertility rate, is already below 2. So the clock is ticking. In another maybe 30 years, maybe slightly less, our median age will have crossed 40. And history suggests, and while of course, and given that I'm on the other side of 45, I would like to say 50 is a new 40. So maybe as science changes, the behaviors will change as well. But what we have seen is that as the median age of a society, of an economy, starts to cross 40, growth rates start to slow down. And we can, of course, if there are questions, we can discuss why. There are very valid reasons why that happens. As per current projections, we are going to cross the median age of 40 in 2053. So that gives us about 30 years, give or take, to cross the upper middle income barrier. So there is a sense of urgency. So we have to do it by 2053. Otherwise, after that, we will remain upper middle income. It's like Eastern Europe has, I think, lost that battle. I think Thailand has lost that battle. My sense is China has lost that battle. But we still have a chance. The bigger challenge for us is that we are doing it while we are a democracy. Most countries, when they passed through this phase, or when they were growing through lower middle income, then upper middle income, then upper income, they were not democracies. There was no universal franchise in the UK till after the First World War. Japan got universal franchise in 1924. The US did it much later. When Korea, Taiwan, they became rich, or they were going through this process, they were dictatorships. Now, the reason why this is a challenge is that at this stage of economic development, inequality automatically goes up. It's almost a given. In fact, when I talk about reasons why or how we can prevent inequality from going beyond control, most senior economists, people who are seen one more generation of change than I have, they say, you can keep hoping, that's not going to happen. Inequality is bound to go up. Because there are economic theories. There was a gentleman called Arthur Lewis who in the 1950s proposed this growth model, where he said that, and he got a Nobel Prize for that in the 70s, so I'm assuming he made sense with what he said, that as a whole generation of people move from agriculture to industry, the supply of labor is in excess, and therefore capital gets more pricing power. And therefore the labor rates, the wage rates do not grow as much. And for that whole generation, inequality climbs. There was another gentleman, Simon Kuznets. Some of his theories have been debunked in the last 30 years, but at least the arguments he made on why at the first stage of development inequality starts to go up, his point was that the most egalitarian societies, the most equal societies, are the most primitive societies. So what you see is in like tribes where there is barely enough food to eat, there is no surplus to go around. So how will there be inequality? Everyone is kind of just surviving. And it's in the whole society's interest that everyone survives. So everyone is some least amount of food, so it gets distributed as equally as it can be. It is only when surpluses start getting created is when inequality starts to go up. So as an economy goes from poor to lower middle income and starts to go up, then surpluses are created. And I can safely say that most people, and all people in this room are part of that elite. We all think we are middle class, but we are not. And we don't do it, explicitly. It's not that we are evil people. It is a very subtle thing. The schools that our kids go to, the privilege that they have in going to a certain college, the fact that the way you speak is a big determinant of what job you get. So elites start to capture the surpluses, and so inequality goes up. At least Kuznets' view was that after a generation, when despite the inequality, the poor have gained some kind of voice, and then through democratic forces, inequality starts to come down. That phase is where has been debunked. In the US, that didn't happen. But at this stage of development, coming back to the point, inequality is bound to go up. And that places an incredibly big challenge for us, because the moment that happens, all of the economic reform and the progress and the development focus has to give way to redistribution. And you're starting to see some of those stresses already starting to play out, right? So you see see how people are interpreting the verdict that we have. You see some of the state government actions that are coming through, and very famously in Karnataka itself, what the political instincts are. Politicians they are mirrors. They reflect the desire of the common man. We can blame them for all the evil things that happen, but they also reflect the needs of the society. And so can we, and this makes it even more challenging, can we really go through this process, maintain this high growth rate, or accelerate from here? Because if we grow at 7% in real terms, which is what we are likely to grow at, and I think in what we call PPP adjusted terms, so purchasing power parity adjusted terms, like in dollar terms, we would be growing at 9%. So our nominal growth, which is real plus inflation, would grow at say 11. Maybe the rupee keeps depreciating against the dollar by 2%, so we get 9% growth. At 9%, you double every 8 years, the rule of 72. So you grow 4 times where you are, you will still be lower middle income, right? Or middle income, or maybe higher, $10,000, $11,000. I don't think that is good enough. So how do we grow faster? Should we be happy being the fastest growing economy in the world? Or should we try to grow faster? There are several good things, which is why I think there is this hope, and then you can see how the world is responding, how every large company in the world wants to invest in India. And we made giant strides in many, many sectors. So let me first lay down the strengths that India has, and then I will spend some time on the challenges. The biggest strength, and it's the most trite comment, so basically the demographic transition. So what it does is it increases the number of workers in the economy. It's as good as, if you're it's the most brutal in sports, where, if there is a lot of fresh blood coming up, the 20-year-olds the 25-year-olds in cricket, or maybe the 18, 20-year-olds in swimming, the more the chances that you will have growth. So there is stronger energy, willingness to learn, ability to learn the new skills, the whole concept of tabula rasa, wherein a child grows with nothing in her brain and then sort of starts with the kids born today are naturals within the internet, because and so they're building on top of that, and which is very important. That is how generational change happens. So having a young population is a very powerful thing. And so if you divide growth into labor input, capital input, total factor productivity, labor input in India should keep growing faster than the rest of the world. And I think that's we don't appreciate how big it is. For example, in the decade of the 2000s, our labor force expansion was 2.5% to 3% a year. Today also, I think the next 5 years, 7 years, we should be growing at 1.5% plus, which is remarkable. Especially given that you think that most developed economies, many of the large parts of the world, are going to see a shrinking workforce. So that just gives you an edge, and 1.5% compounded over a while is a lot of growth. The second advantage that comes from this part of the economy is, the demographic side, is savings. So what starts to happen is that, as your total fertility rate has fallen, your savings automatically start to go up, because this is the classic dependency ratio argument that you must have heard of, that how many non-workers do you have per worker. And so the next 25, 30 years is when, because the number of children per couple is starting to fall, old age population is not rising fast enough. 30 years later, it will start rising very rapidly, so demographic pressures will start to rise. But in the next 25, 30 years, you will have more workers per consumer. And that means there will be more savings, because people will save like you and I do. We save for our future, we save for our kids' education. And then, because there is so much of saving, the cost of capital starts coming down. And that is traditionally been a source of tremendous competitive advantage. So when the UK was an emerging economy, when the Belgians and the Dutch were already a developed economy. And one very major driver of that was that the Dutch are natural savers. And the cost of capital in the Netherlands was much lower than the cost of capital in England. And therefore, on anything capital intensive, the Dutch had a natural advantage. So if your cost of capital starts to fall, I think it's a huge competitive advantage. So India has been struggling for a while, and I hope that we are able to bring it down. It's one of the challenges. I'll address that. But that also is a big advantage that comes out of the demographic transition. Let me then talk about another aspect, which is total factor productivity, which is how efficiently do we use the labor and the capital that we get. Now, total factor productivity in economic terms is considered what they call a residual, right? So you look at, say, India is growing at 7%. Okay, labor input is 1.5, capital input is growing at 4.5. So what else is driving that extra 1%? And then you say, okay, that is TFP. But if you think about what drives TFP, it becomes easier to predict it. What drives TFP is how regulations work. So, for example, in India today, given that now I work in Aadhaar, in India Semiconductor Mission, and various bodies with bureaucrats, I can tell you that the bureaucrat of today is night and day different from the bureaucrat of 20 years back. As you know, in the bureaucracy, there are layers and hierarchy. So there are joint secretaries, the 40 to 50-year-olds, the additional secretaries who are the 46, 47 to 53, 54-year-olds, and there are the secretaries who are generally 52, 53 to 60, 58, 60 years old. And so the joint secretaries are the guys who really do the work, right? The secretaries are mostly direction giving. I mean, they add a lot of value, but the joint secretaries of today have had a very different lived experience than what their predecessors had, in the sense that the joint secretaries who were in the saddle in the mid to late 90s, maybe earlier parts of the 2000s, were all people who had lived in or who had grown up in a control environment. So their belief in market forces was very weak. Today, what you find is that there are secretaries who will question regulators and say, if market forces are working, why are you trying to administer prices? If a certain thing that the government provides is at 100 rupees and there are people who are reluctant in allowing for, say, market level bidding, they say, well, let the market forces decide what is the cost of that service. And you see that more and more. I mean, so I'm quite amazed at how deep is that level of change. And therefore, the government itself is changing. And as the private sector becomes, and the market forces start to play a much bigger role, the allocation of resources is much superior, far superior. And that is a very deep-rooted driver of productivity. So TFP growth in China is negative now, just as a contrast, right? Because the state there is afraid of the private sector. They are starting to take back control, and they are starting to allocate resources themselves, and they will, right now they're succeeding, and there's we'll discuss that, but I think these are medium-term risks. But in India, we're going the other way, and I think this is great. There is another major driver of productivity, which is our domination of services exports. And this is something that I think Bangalore has taken the lead on, Hyderabad has taken the lead on. The transformation that IT services industry brought about was not just that we got so many dollars, or that it drove a whole new middle class, it developed new urban centers. It was also that it brought in, that was how expertise came in. So when China joined the WTO, it wasn't just that their exports helped them grow income and pull workers out of poverty. It was also that manufacturing expertise flowed back to China. And over 15-20 years, they built on that, and now they are world leaders in a lot of these manufacturing technologies. We are starting to do that in services. So we have seen IT services, but now what is happening is, and it's quite remarkable, that business services exports, I think, are going to be much bigger in the next 20 years than IT services were in the last 30 years. And what do I mean by business services exports? Everything from strategy consulting to global procurement, to designing satellites, to designing rockets, to designing electric vehicles, designing semiconductor chips, you name it. And we have the people, and the some of these are already reasonably well developed, but some of them are still nascent but growing really rapidly. Now, as these grow, this is a very powerful channel of transfer of expertise from global firms to India. And I think this is a very, very strong driver of productivity. We have also learned to solve and use digitization. So as I talked about all the challenges of growing as a democracy at 4 times the pace at which most countries have achieved it, and all the challenges that come along with it. But there's a huge advantage we have, which is the development of digital infrastructure and the digital public infrastructure. So what that allows us to do is create networks of people which are much larger than would have been possible otherwise. See, humans as a species have become very successful because we've learned to collaborate, we've learned to cooperate. Because individually, our brains are not powerful enough. In fact, there is a theory that the Neanderthal brain was much larger than that of the human, but the Neanderthals could not cooperate as well as humans could. Now, the way it works is that if you can create larger and larger systems, like, there is this theory that to be able to afford a physicist, you need 100,000 people. Because a physicist, nothing against physicists, I wanted to become a physicist myself. A physicist adds value over 30 to 50 years. to be able to afford a physicist who will develop something that you will find incredibly powerful, like semiconductors or understanding gravity, sending rockets in space. All of that requires very deep physics. But for the first 50, 60 years, these guys were just looking at stars and sort of drawing diagrams, right? To support something like that, someone like that, you need a very large population. To be able to afford a neurosurgeon, imagine how much, how many people you need to have a critical mass of the type of diseases that the neurosurgeon can spend 20, 25 years learning and then find it commercially viable, right? So the larger the economic network that you can create, the more powerful the economy can be. Now, what digitization allows us to do by cutting down the cost of transactions. So for example, you take UPI, you take some of the new layers that are being built on top of that. You take Aadhaar, which I've inherited a lot of the good work that has been done. But I'm so proud of the fact that the transactional cost of the state delivering something straight to the citizen has been brought down to nearly zero. Now, this didn't exist 20 years back. In fact, frankly, this still doesn't exist in most other places. But we managed to solve it, and I think this is a huge advantage. So we are in a position to use and leverage on this India stack, and so I think what the iSpirit guys have managed, and in collaboration with some visionary leaders in the government, across parties, and of course the bureaucrats playing along, regulators playing along, we are building a public infrastructure which is quite remarkable and very efficient. We have also started to solve what I call micro-level productivity problems. So if you are using very inefficient, dense forms of energy, you are likely to be very inefficient. The moment you start to use cooking gas and electricity, or you start to have temperature control. In fact, while we were waiting for the session to start, Lan and I we were discussing, and Karthik as well, we were discussing how high temperature makes us inefficient. This is something that my kids keep complaining about. I never thought this was actually scientifically proven, but it is actually proven that if the average temperature goes up, exam performance starts to weaken, productivity starts to fall, because then the brain is more focused on managing the heat regulation in the body than it is in solving complex problems. All of these things we are starting to solve at a massive scale. Just to give you perspective, the world started to have telephones from the 1890s. Maybe slightly before that, the telegraph came in 1870s. Then, the wireless telephony came in the 1980s, then 2G happened, and 3G happened, and 4G happened. For almost 50% of India, maybe 60, 70% of India, what took 120, 130 years in the US happened in 5 years. Right? So they went from having no phones to having the cheapest data in the world. Now, this is what drives productivity. This is what accelerates productivity. So we have to repeat it in many, many more sectors. And we are starting to solve those problems. That's something that gives me a lot of confidence that we can drive this productivity growth. We can close the barrier to, or to close the gap to the productivity frontier. Now we come to capital formation. So we discussed how challenging it is to aspire to do what we are trying to do, to make India a developed country in the next 25, 30 years. That has never been done before in the form that we are trying to do it. China didn't have these challenges. We do have them. We then discussed what is it that makes me happy about the next 10, 15 years of that steady TFP growth, very powerful demographic transition. The economic cycles are driven by the third factor which drives growth, which is capital formation. Capital is an absolutely integral part of growth, because you do anything. You want to move from point A to point B faster, you need a lot of energy, but you also need to form a lot of capital. You want to buy a car, you need to buy an aircraft. Getting an airline running requires a lot of financial jugglery. So capital formation in India, a very large part of that is residential so far. We need to start solving, and I'll come to that when we talk about challenges in the formation of urban infrastructure, but I'll come to that. In the previous decade, between 2012 and 2021, our growth rates had started to slow. If you recall, 2012, people said India's growth rate was 8%, trend growth was 8%, and then by the end of that decade, people had started to talk about India growing at 6.5%. The reason was that capital formation had started to slow, and a very large part of that was the slowdown in the real estate market. So one of the things that has happened in the last 2-3 years is that after a decade-long slowdown, the real estate market has started to turn. Now, generally, when these cycles turn, they last for a long time. So that gives me comfort that at least for the next 3 to 5 years, the capital formation cycle will be positive. And I can run you through the details on why these are sustainable cycles. These are very long-term cycles. But that cycle is turning, so which is good for us, right? So I mean the decade-long lull or the decade-long slowdown in growth in capital formation is now behind us. The second very large part of capital formation is in energy. Most economic theories, I think, emphasize this. If you haven't followed this gentleman called Václav Smil, I would strongly suggest that you do, how energy and civilization are very, very deeply connected. So if you want to think about societies, think about how it uses its energy. And as we grow, we need more and more energy. You can't grow without consuming more energy. The channels of providing that energy, capturing and providing that energy, are a major source of capital formation. So what we did between 2003, when the Electricity Act was passed, and 2016-17, when those plants that were getting commissioned got built, was we built too much of power capacity. So our growth was kind of overstated. After that, for 7 years, 8 years, we saw a sharp lull in the power plant construction. And so, you know, each power plant is like in 1,000 megawatt, a 1 gigawatt power plant will cost $1 billion. So if you want to build 200 gigawatts of power capacity, which we may need to over the next 7-8 years, maybe 5-6 years, I would say, if you want to be ambitious, you will need to invest $150-200 billion, and that's a lot of capital formation. So both these cycles, the real estate cycle and the energy generation cycle, I think we are at the cusp of an upturn, and that gives me comfort that the economy on the capital formation side should be quite good as well. Now, in the next 5-7 minutes, I'll discuss all the challenges that exist in front of us. The biggest challenge, in my view, is the fact that we don't manage our cities well. So when you compare a rich country, see, the best way to figure out what you need to do in order to grow is to look at a rich country, look at yourself and say, okay, so what are the things that they're doing that we are not? We may take a very different path to growth, so and that's a very different question. But what is it? Why is it that when you go to a European city or a Japanese city and you see that the people have a reasonable amount of leisure time, they're taking their kids around on weekends, they have quite a bit of vacation time, especially in Europe, but they live rich lives, comfortable lives, their per capita GDP is so high. Why is it that we can't do that? Now, so there is human capital, of course, education and health, which of course are very important, but there is also what they call capital stock. So if you have metro rail, if you have highways, you have very good buildings, very efficient buildings. I mean, this is a very, very impressive building. That's capital stock. You have machinery, you have robots. I think this is what capital stock looks like. Now, what we have, I think, managed to do is learned how to build the capital stock that connect urban centers or population centers. What we have struggled to do, and we are terrible at, is urban infrastructure. Because our governance in urban infrastructure is absolutely haphazard. Less than 5% of fiscal resources go directly to cities. In China, it is more than 50%. Now, there are things that China has done that we would not want to replicate, but what they've done remarkably well is urbanize, because urban living is far more efficient. If you're thinking about Vikisit Bharat in 25 years, we will be looking at a much more urban India. And frankly, if the rapid pace of urbanization leads us to the kind of traffic jams we see in Bangalore or that we see in central Mumbai, where I live, then there's no way that we can grow. Now, we need to solve for that, and I don't think we are currently prepared to solve for that. I don't think there is enough of a political consensus or even an understanding or a consensus among policymakers as to what needs to be done. Because once you know what needs to be done, then the consensus building can start, the social consensus building can start, and people can start understanding, oh, this is a must. If you don't do it, you can't grow. And I think that's the number one challenge in my view as we think about the next 10, 15 years. And unless we solve, and this will require gut-wrenching reforms, this will require shifts in power centers. Like, state governments will have to allow big cities to grow for themselves. This will allow, there will be chances that there are 1,000 cities that need to grow. Maybe 300 of them will have very corrupt officials. There will be massive corruption scandals. There will be political victims of that. But all of that needs to happen for the remaining 700 to actually grow very fast. Or even those 300 will grow fast. There will be some corruption. Yeah, so we need to build the social consensus to that. The second big change that we need to make is something that there's a group of us, including some of the very incredible folks at iSpirit, where we're talking about how to make India a product nation. See, India, there's no country in the world which has become rich without owning intellectual property, without creating brands. The reason why I think China has been struggling, and I think there are issues with China, is because they were too late along this path. I mean, they started investing in some of these things 15 years back, but the way they've gone about it is there's a bit of a warp there. Thailand has just missed the bus. The few countries that have broken through the middle income trap are Spain, are Taiwan, or Korea. Now, the reason why this is such a challenge is that the path that you take to go from low income to middle income is very different from the path that you need to take from middle income to high income. For example, that you're taking the same example as I used for 4G. The fact that everyone else did 4G and 7 years later you took the cheap equipment, implemented it very well, I think we did a great job with that, is great. But you can't use that to compete against countries that are going from 5G to 6G. So if you want to be the leader in 6G, you need to have very different types of risk capital, because some people will fail. 4G was almost a given, right? A proven technology, cheap equipment, implementation was the risk. When you're doing 6G, there will be new types of devices, new types of business models. You'll have to take risks. And same with the next generation of software, the next generation of mobility. I think the risk-taking ability, the ability to have world-leading technology. I mean, you think about the phones. There are only a few companies in the world that make all the value add from the phones. The company that makes the crystals that go into the liquid crystals, the company that makes the glass, the brand owner, of course, the Samsungs and the Apples of the world. That's about it, and maybe some of the chipset suppliers like Qualcomm. Most companies which are involved in this ecosystem don't make money. And it is there where the branding, the IP control becomes so important. Now, if we have to get there, we need to change the way our society thinks, our policymakers think, how the government works. We are headed into a world of industrial policy. The world of the last 50 years is not going to be the world of the next 30 years, partly because of what China is doing, and it's a massive risk for us. Just to give you perspective, in the last 4 years, incremental or medium to long-term loans to industry has grown by $1.9 trillion in China. Just the incremental loans to industry is $1.9 trillion. For a perspective on scale, India's total banking system loan book is $2 trillion. That includes agri loans, services loans, mortgages, everything. In China, just incremental loans to industry in the last 4 years is $1.9 trillion. And this is not stopping. In the next 5 years, there will be another $2.5 to $3 trillion of loans that will be given to industry. How do you fight that? Now, it's not just a challenge for us. In fact, we can try to take advantage of some of this investment they're doing. We get some things very cheap. But this is a world where barriers will be going up because the developed world will want to contest that. And then we have to find out a way of how we start to grow our own technology, our own companies, and create the ecosystem effect so that by the time we start hitting the middle income levels, maybe in another 15 years or 12, 13 years, we are ready to break through that. Because, you can't start solving those problems when you hit the upper middle income level. And which is why I think the ecosystem shift to owning brands, developing our own technologies, on biotech, on semiconductors, on space, on aircraft, on mobility, on energy. I think all of those things we need to start developing in our industry, academia, and government. All have to come together to create this ecosystem. A third major challenge is, and this is the structure of the government itself. For example, in this world where energy mixes are becoming very fungible, why is it that you need a Ministry of Power, a Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, Ministry of Coal, a Ministry of Oil and Gas? You should have one Ministry of Energy and 5 joint secretaries looking at them. Now, the way our government is structured, and frankly, I know I'm much more familiar with the central government, and we all are, right? But we don't track the state government that much. State governments are even more archaic in their structuring. They're still structured for the economy and the policies of the 1980s. And we need to dramatically change the way the governments run. And unless we can do that, I think the growth path will be very troubling. And of course, control of energy. So I think there's a lot of geopolitics that we'll have to get involved in. No country in the world has grown rich without controlling its sources of energy. You look back at history. The US has a lot of oil and gas. Russia has a lot of oil and gas. The UK, when it was growing rich, it had a lot of coal. It used a lot of coal. China has used a lot of coal. India is pretty much the only large, or maybe Japan and France did it, but they use a lot of nuclear power. And frankly, they are still small compared to where India is. And so if we need a lot of energy, we need to find mechanisms to assure that at a very cheap cost over the next 30, 40 years. And that's another big challenge. So with that, I've taken quite a bit of time. I'll stop there.